Hi everyone. When I was asked to give a talk about responsible journalism in a tobacco harm reduction context, I did wonder if 10 minutes of silence might be the most eloquent statement I could make, but in the interests of being constructive, I'll give it a go. In this overview, I'll characterize just some of the problems, and I'll propose some tentative ways to reduce the harms of journalism. I'll be talking primarily of the US context where I work, but there are applicable situations in many other places. First, I think it's really important to understand that the media's antipathy to tobacco harm reduction is not unique. Rather, it should be understood as merely the latest iteration of a long and disgraceful lineage of media portrayals of drugs and, more to the point, of the people who use them. We could go right back to the early 20th century and the origins of the prohibitions of currently illegal drugs in racist, fear-mongering media campaigns. But let's consider two more recent broad US examples: the so-called crack era of the 1980s and early 90s, and the so-called opioid epidemic that ramped up in the early 2000s and continues today. Briefly, crack era coverage was characterized, for example, by alarmism, by racist depictions of people who use crack cocaine, and by distortions of reality like the notion that crack is fundamentally different from powder cocaine. Actually, the two are chemically almost identical, with the main difference in user experience being the faster-acting, shorter nature of crack's high. Opioid epidemic coverage, in turn, has been characterized by alarmism, by marginally subtler racism in depictions of innocent white communities ravaged compared with black communities where deaths are ignored, or dealer versus victim narratives, and classism too, and by distortions of reality, like the erasure of the facts that a substantial majority of opioid-involved deaths involved opioids combined with other drugs, and that the vast majority of people who use opioids do so non-problematically and even beneficially. I hope you're already seeing parallels with vaping coverage. Critically, in each case, crack, opioids, vaping, media and government have created a negative feedback loop, fueling policies that ruin lives. For example, the crack outcry, with crack seen as a black drug, notoriously led to a federal sentencing disparity of 100 to 1 between equal quantities of crack and powder cocaine, since reformed to only 18 to 1. But let's unpack some coverage problems in common. Alarmism obviously stems from the constant pressure in media to sell copies, or more often these days, get clicks. None of us in the industry is immune. Even running a non-profit publication with no advertising or subscriber model to worry about, I have no doubt that if our traffic dried up, our grants would too. The old journalism adage has it that dog bites man isn't really a story, but man bites dog, that's a story. One thing I know is that man and dog get on well is definitely not seen as a story. And so, with drugs and vapes and other areas of life, lurid depictions of carnage consistently outperform balanced, realistic portrayals in bottom-line terms. Another severe failing in common is the demonization or marginalization of people with certain identities. Consider, in this context, the demographic composition of journalism. In the US, but not only here, it's very white and disproportionately people from well-off backgrounds. In the US particularly, entering journalism typically requires months or years of unpaid or underpaid work as an intern, freelancer, or entry-level employee, and this is prohibitive to many people without existing resources. Casual othering by such a structurally limited group, whose articles often pander to people with similar backgrounds and prejudices, is endemic. It's easy to see how this plays out with tobacco harm reduction. Who are the people who smoke at the highest rates? We know it's people with low incomes or living in poverty, people with mental health diagnoses, LGBTQ people, military veterans, indigenous people and other ethnic minorities, people, in other words, who are not from the social groups that dominate journalism, among which, faced with far fewer life stressors, most people don't smoke or were able to quit. And who gets centered in vaping coverage? Overwhelmingly, it is not the smokers who are dying at a rate of almost 500,000 a year in the US. Rather, it is the whiter, wealthier, vaping teenagers who resemble the demographic of journalism itself and whose parents can access the platforms to make their voices heard. Innocent victim narratives play well in media, and it's notable that fear-mongering about children's drug use has long been used to justify restrictions, prohibition, and criminalization for adults. It's so much of a trope that it's referred to as the think of the children argument in US drug policy reform circles. One obvious example is the debunked but still propagated gateway theory, according to which cannabis use causes uptake of other drugs. The final common problem I want to identify, the distortions of reality and science to serve a narrative aided by reams of junk science, is familiar to all of us in the tobacco harm reduction context, and I'll leave it to people better qualified than me to unpick. Despite the vaping panic's direct ancestry in other drug scares, there are of course unique contours to this situation. Vaping was developed intentionally to reduce harms, making its demonization all the more damning. It's still relatively new, and what's unknown is often feared. Events, too, have sometimes lent themselves to anti-vaping opportunism. We might characterize 3 waves of anti-vaping coverage in the reaction to perceived youth uptake, the reaction to the 2019 US outbreak of lung injuries wrongly attributed to nicotine vapes, and lately the unevidenced suggestion that vaping exacerbates COVID-19. Another factor is the unique position of vaping as both legal, mostly, although there are those working against that, and industry-driven, including by companies that have previously and justifiably in many instances been regarded purely as enemies of public health. As many of us know too well, the notion that companies that sell the cigarettes that kill so many may have a role to play in mitigating their damage alongside booming vape-only companies is ungraspable or unacceptable to many, and is time and again weaponized by media against tobacco harm reduction. What are the answers? I definitely have no silver bullet, and incrementally chipping away at the lies might often be the best we can do for now. But there are some things I think we should remember. First, the fragmentation of media in the digital age is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it harms us by removing many publications' capacity to have specialized reporters and ensuring rapid dissemination of misinformation from platform to platform. But in other ways, it can help us. We all have social media accounts to deploy. Anyone with $50 to spend on GoDaddy can start a website, and there are excellent THR blogs. I hope that Filter plays an important role in hosting a better kind of coverage. And while all of this may seem small compared to the media giants, it can accumulate. Our own work, for example, has been republished or cited in larger, more mainstream outlets. Efforts are also underway, though not enough, to consciously diversify the journalism field, and Filter has been proud to play a small part. Second, remember some things about journalists when you engage with them. Most are not bad, just ignorant. All of us are ignorant about some things, but the only sin is an unwillingness to learn. Journalists are under intense time pressure, often writing about subjects in which they have no specialization, and it is natural for them to be inclined to give credence to public health bodies, even if we know that when it comes to tobacco harm reduction, they routinely deserve no such thing. If you have the chance to engage with a journalist, I urge you to do so. There's little left to lose, given how bad it has been, even from the likes of the New York Times, The Guardian, New York Magazine, and so many more. But there is often something to gain, even if only the planting of a seed. Refusing to engage with an outlet, however egregious its coverage, is ultimately self-defeating. Be courteous and agreeable, however little they seem to deserve it, because, as humans, journalists do, in practice, find it harder to denigrate the ideas of people who behave like that. And educate journalists at a level that matches a non-specialist's capabilities. Take the trouble, for example, to summarize a study's findings in a nutshell rather than just sending them the link. Prioritize your talking points. Pay attention to the leanings of the publication to which you're speaking, deploying, for example, social justice and health equity arguments to those on the left, or perhaps individual liberty arguments to those on the right. And edit yourself. It is true that the anti-vaping movement is awash with Bloomberg dollars, but responding to suspicion of the vaping industry by saying the other side's funding is bad is not always, in my opinion, the most productive avenue in a conversation that should be about science and efficacy and human rights and saving millions of lives. Finally, take heart. As well as knowing that we are right and that more and more evidence from long-term vaping populations will continue to demonstrate that we're right, we should remember that justified causes that once seemed hopeless have succeeded, including at a media level. Cannabis was effectively made illegal in the US amid an anti-Mexican media campaign in the first half of the 20th century. As recently as 2006, Only 32% of Americans supported legalization. Today, that figure stands at 67%. And the spread of legalization state by state and at a federal level and overseas is, I believe, unstoppable. Cannabis has many medical and social benefits, as well as the obvious positives of not arresting and incarcerating people. And the media has in recent years significantly helped to amplify these, creating a positive feedback loop in place of what came before. Even the benefits of cannabis legalization are dwarfed by the prospect of switching the world's billion smokers to a far, far safer option. And despite my earlier line about man and dog get on well, I do believe that the emergence of innovations capable of making cigarettes obsolete is a huge, dramatic, powerful story if well told. The truth will win out, but it will win out faster if, despite the headwinds, we continue to challenge, engage with, contribute to, and reimagine the media that has done so much harm. Thank you.